Uh, we got one hand up. Let's see. Roy, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Good evening, everyone. Wanted to address the issue of a nice publication that came out. They come out once a year, and it's the Flood Prevention and Protection document. And I addressed the Flood Board in 2018 and asked them to add in a key clause of potential flooding as settlement. The settlement wasn't or subsidence. It wasn't really mentioned, and no one really had awareness of the major impact that settlement has. So from 2000, so the board took up my request, and in the next publication, which was 2019, they added the settlement and also sea level rise, and that continued through 2021. Now, I don't recall seeing that publication come out in 2022, but it did come out in 2023, much abbreviated, and it went back to the same description of what are the flooding risk in Corte Madera, and it went back to three sources: extreme high tides, storm runoffs, and inadequate storm drainage infrastructure. Why they went back to 2018 and didn't take the information from the 2021 document, I don't know. The name of the document changed from Flood Prevention and Protection to Flood Protection and Prevention. So they've just flipped those two. So I wanted to know why the document changed the information and removed the settlement information, which is very critical to understanding what the causes of flooding are in this area. And I live in Mariner Cove. I've lived in Mariner Cove for over half a century. Only been flooded 3 times, and it wasn't from Mother Nature. It was from the Marin Municipal Water District water mains breaking, busting out and flooding the whole area on Seawolf Passage. So I would appreciate if the flood board would put that back into that document. It was a very nice document. And Bob, if you could get back to me an email, let me know why that was done, and hopefully you can take up the request again to add the settlement or subsidence information back into that document. Thank you.
Thanks, Roy. We could agendize that for a future meeting, but I will just say that in the past, we were able to add a lot more from the flood board, from the engineering department to this standard boilerplate newsletter that was supposed to go out to satisfy FEMA. And they restricted what we could add to it and limited our ability to really customize it, for Corte Madera. But we'll put that on the agenda for a future item. Thank you. Approval of the action minutes. Was there anybody else online?
No one else.
Okay. Approval of action minutes for February 10th, 2025. Any comments, changes, questions? Move to approve. Second?
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Okay. Presentations, proposed zoning ordinance amendment to allow waterfront property owners who raise their homes to also raise their attached decks. Chris.
Yeah, so our first presentation will be from Tracy and Amy, possibly Claire too, from our community development department. And as mentioned, we'll be discussing zoning ordinance amendments regarding decks on waterfront properties.
Great, thank you. Good evening, Chair Bundy and members of the Flood Board. My name is Amy Lyle. I serve as your Community Development Director. And then we have Tracy Haggerty here, Associate Planner. And so we really appreciate being able to come to you tonight. This is a little bit different than I think some of your other items. And this is really related to a zoning ordinance that we are working on. And I will say that as we know in Corte Madera, we have a lot of hazards. You're either in a floodplain, flood zone, or in the wildland urban interface. Sometimes you're in both. And our zoning code is really adept at trying to meet the needs of our homeowners and property owners while still working to meet the needs of the overall community. So it is definitely a balance. And through our shoreline engagement effort, we heard that there needed to be more assistance with people raising homes, making it easier, looking for grant money. Through that process, Tracy and the planning team worked on an ordinance to streamline the design review process for raising homes. And that was just last year, I believe. Yes, so just last year. And usually when you touch the code, you want to make sure that you're getting it right. And we don't always get it right. And it takes some time to really understand as people go to raise homes. Are there other issues that we inadvertently missed or other things that should be addressed? And something came up. We have a homeowner that applied for this zoning ordinance. And something we missed is really taking into account deck area and allowing the ability to raise decks. So that's really the issue tonight. Tracy and the team created a very thorough staff report for you, and we want to get your input. And tonight also serves as a workshop for the community. So we did publicize this widely, and we're hoping that some people come and provide us input. And the applicant is here tonight as well. So we want to be able to present to you and then see if there's any questions, comments, and open this up for the public. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Tracy for the presentation.
Good evening. My name is Tracy Hegarty. Nice to meet many of you. Some of you I do know already. And as Amy and Chris and Bob said, the planning staff is here to host a public workshop using your meeting forum, hoping to attract people that any of these modifications to our zoning ordinance would affect. There isn't any action being asked for or that's required by the flood board tonight. We just want to have a discussion and get your input and invite members of the public who want to provide comment on anything I talk about or ask questions to provide their input as well. As Amy talked about this briefly, and I'll summarize really briefly. We made some modifications to our zoning ordinance last year that the council adopted in August. And one of those modifications was to carve out an exemption to design review for people that raise their house above base flood elevation. So that is effective. And to date, we've approved 2 building permits for people to raise their homes that would have otherwise required design review. One of those permits includes an addition that wouldn't have otherwise required design review with their project, and they're raising their home. There's a few more that we think will be approving this year also, based on our conversations we've had with different members of the community. And as Amy said, in January, the owner of 299 Goldenheim Passage filed an application to amend our zoning ordinance, and they're seeking additional flexibility related to decks that are attached to homes that have been elevated. They intend to raise the finished floor of their home by 2 feet 8 inches, and they'd like to include they'd like to include their deck area as part of the project and raise that to the same level as the finished floor of the home. Our zoning ordinance doesn't allow for that completely. There are 2 development standards that are inhibiting homeowners' ability to raise larger deck areas when they elevate their house. One of those things is lot coverage, and the other one is setback requirements. You're all very familiar probably with this screen. There's about 1,200 parcels in Corte Madera that are in the flood zone. And that's computes to about 34% of all parcels. That's a significant amount. Some homeowners in the flood zone elevate their homes voluntarily. Other ones are required to do so when a project is a substantial improvement. On the slide here is elevated homes that did this project within the last 15 years. There's about 55 homes in Corte Madera that have been raised above base flood elevation over the amount of time that I've looked back further than 15 years. Some of the homes that have been raised are in the Mariner Cove neighborhood, and a lot of them are on Golden Hind Passage. There's an attachment to the report I prepared in your packet. It's attachment 1, and that is a list of the homes that have been elevated since 2016, and it includes the amount that each home has been raised. As I said, one of the development standards that affects how much deck areas, landings, and stairs a home can have when it's elevated is lot coverage. Lot coverage regulates how much of the lot can be covered by structures. The purpose of lot coverage is to control the concentration of structures on a lot and maintain open spaces. In Corte Madera, the properties that are in the flood zone are in just so happen to be in our R1 medium density residential zoning district. And the maximum allowed coverage in R1 depends on the size of your lot. There's no maximum for smaller lots that are 4,500 square feet. We don't have very many of those in the flood zone, if any at all. So most coverage requirements for parcels in the flood zone are going to be around 40%. And you can get up to 44% coverage. We add 2% for decks and patios and trellises, and then an additional 2% when you elevate your home to account for raised landings that are needed to access the higher finished floor. This slide is just showing a graphic of what I just talked about. A deck that is more than 3 feet in height, it counts as coverage towards that 40% or 44% I talked about maximum. A deck, however, that's 3 feet or less in height does not count as coverage. Raising a home above base flood elevation, oftentimes it increases the height of a home by about 2 to 5 feet. That's what we're seeing today. And that's going to impact the stairs, landings, and decks that are attached to it, the height of those. And oftentimes those new decks and stairs to access the higher finished floor, they're more than 3 feet in height. So you have new lot coverage when somebody raises their home. And where we are seeing people that elevate their homes are approaching maximum lot coverage and often exceeding it and needing that extra 2% that's offered. Oftentimes, and you see this two-level deck design. And before I describe what's on this slide, in 2009, the town recognized that homes that are elevated are approaching maximum lot coverage and added that extra 2% that I'm talking about. An extra 2% for a lot that's most lots in the flood zone range from 6,000 to 8,000 square feet in area. So an extra 2% only computes to about 120 to 160 square feet, which is not very much if you take into account existing deck areas and the amount of stairs or size of landings that are needed just to access the higher finished floor. And as shown on this slide, if lot coverage isn't sufficient, you end up with this two-level deck design where you have a higher deck that's used to access the finished floor, the raised finished floor of the home, and then there's steps down to a lower deck that's 3 feet in height or less and doesn't count as coverage. And that's what this slide is showing, that two-tier design. The two-level deck designs can be problematic for some homeowners, especially on the waterfront, because during storm and high tide events, the decks can be submerged. And this photo is showing the existing lower deck area of 299 Golden Hind Passage, and it hasn't been raised yet, but you can see it's covered in water in this picture. It's not only makes the deck unusable, but it causes some significant wear and tear on the deck to be covered from time to time by water. It's just another picture of sunny day flooding on the water. And it just clearly shows that raised decks and deck areas generally are important to these property owners. A second development standard that can limit the amount of raised deck areas attached to an elevated home is required setbacks. A setback is a required open area and is the minimum distance that a structure needs to be away from a property line. In Corte Madera, the required rear yard setback is 25 feet. And our zoning ordinance allows certain things in a required rear yard setback, and one of those things is decks. And there's a red box on this slide showing that a deck that's 3 feet or less in height can be as close as 5 feet to the side and rear property lines. That's what this slide's also showing. On the left-hand side is a graphic representing the permitted location of a deck that's 3 feet or less in height. And that striped area shows where that deck can be located. And a raised deck, meaning a deck that's more than 3 feet in height, can only extend 6 feet into the required front or rear yard. And in the rear yard, that means that a deck attached often to an elevated home needs to have a 19-foot setback from the rear property line. You guys feel free to stop me if you have questions as we're going along. Staff has been studying this zoning ordinance amendment application and considered a couple of different policy options that could be implemented to solve the issue at hand. One of those is that the town could consider an increase to total allowed lot coverage. I've stated before that you can get up to 44% if your house is elevated. The town could consider increasing that by another 2 to 4%. And this regulation applies to any property in the R1 zone, in the flood zone, that elevates their home. Can get up to 44%. So that's one way to address the issue at hand. And for the applicant, it would need to be combined with one of the other two options on the slide here, and that is to modify the way that we measure lot coverage. I talked a lot about how a deck that is 3 feet or less in height does not count towards coverage. Additionally, a deck that is greater than 15 feet in height, so for instance, for a hillside home, that only counts at 1/2, at 50%. So since a deck attached to an elevated home is going to be between 3 and 5 feet in height, that's much lower than a 15-foot high deck, and potentially you could count a deck that's between 3 and 5 feet on an elevated home at a reduced rate at 30 or 40% of its actual coverage. An alternative to that would be to treat decks that are attached to an elevated home and are between 3 and 5 feet that normally count as coverage to not count those as coverage. So essentially you'd be treating a deck that's attached to an elevated home up to a certain extent, up to 5 feet, the same as we treat a deck that's 3 feet in height. And the second policy option that we've been thinking about and are seeking your thoughts on, or the public's thoughts on, are modifications to setbacks for decks that are 3 to 5 feet in height for elevated properties. Our existing regulations allow raised decks to extend into the rear yard. A raised deck meaning over 3 feet. And that extent that it can extend is that yellow bar, only 6 feet, as I mentioned before. So it's got to have a 19-foot setback. The modification that staff is thinking about is that a deck for an elevated home that's the same as the finished floor and not higher than 5 feet would have the same required setbacks that a 3-foot deck has, which is the striped red box. And our existing regulations allow the footprint of the deck to go 5 feet from side and rear property. I know that was a lot of numbers, and if anybody has questions, yes.
This is Brian Schnar. I had a question. When we're considering the policy objectives for houses that are right against the waterfront, in which case there is no rear neighboring property, what is the policy goal achieved by rear setbacks?
Well, zoning, as Amy kind of alluded to this, that you have zoning for many, not for, 50. I'd probably say go along that section of Golden Hind, the waterfront, there's 90 parcels from number 1 Golden Hind Passage along San Clemente Creek, going all around to the Cove School. There's about 90 parcels. So sometimes zoning code you know, I think what you're saying, if, correct if I'm wrong, is that why have a setback if it's just water? Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, some of these properties, as we see in your sunny day photos, they're surrendering the land on high tide days or what have you. And so I'm, trying to be sensitive to the people who have a property line that is slowly kind of going away. If they can deck out to their property line, what's the negative policy implication there?
We used to allow a deck to occupy any required yard, meaning it could, but that's 3 feet or less in height, meaning you could have a deck with a 0 setback as long as it's the lower type of deck, the 3-foot high deck. And we recently changed that because we were seeing some problems with particularly where there is another property on the side or below, and the deck is up here and the fence is not. And so they're looking right down, and we didn't really, adjust it for waterfront property owners specifically. But I think it's usually a good idea to keep some sort of setback from property lines, or we're going to start asking you to verify property lines, meaning surveyor verification. Show us that if it's a 0 setback, is it really 0? So good.
Yeah, I'll just add, this is a very unique situation, and which is why this is prepared the way it is. But in general, you want some kind of setback from property lines so you're able to do maintenance on the structures within your property. So in this case, it might be the Audubon Society or someone else on the other side of the fence or your deck. But you still do not want to require the property owner to go into someone else's property to maintain the structures on the property itself. So it's just a good measure. There are some, for instance, housing subdivisions that have 0 lot lines, but they generally have an easement agreement or something to say that the adjacent property owner is allowed to maintain and do whatever's needed. So it's really just a property maintenance thing that has happened over time.
Thank you. That's helpful.
And just one comment also on that, the closer you get to the water, the more likely you're going to be entering sensitive habitat and need regulatory permits. So it exponentially makes it more difficult to build. So it's best to set back anyways. So
David. Not easy.
David Bell, somewhat related, it's easy to measure the setback on the side and the front, but how is it measured to the water line, like mean average tide? Because that's just constantly changing. High water?
Property line.
So it was said,
The lot line itself or the deck location?
measuring how much setback, where do you measure it from the water line to the property, to the deck?
Oh, I see. It is from the property line itself. So it may be, have no relation to the water line, but there is a defined property.
Okay.
Yeah, Tracy, I wanted to clarify, the purpose of this is just for homes that are on the water? Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah, so I think, Philip makes a lot of sense that, if you, it makes, I think the idea of leaving it at 5 feet, which is, most people aren't going to really go out that far anyway, but just to allow the 5-foot deck going out in the backyard without concern about impacting the neighbor, but just to be able to maintain the property.
And just want to reiterate too that this is there's not a new footprint for a deck that we're saying to allow. It's actually that the deck itself is higher, right? Right now we allow it to be 3 feet, and when you raise your home, 3 feet is not at the same level of the finished floor. So we would allow an additional 2 feet.
Right.
And this is what we're considering as far as who could benefit from some of these regulations. And for simplicity for the end user, we've identified all of these parcels on the odd numbers along Golden Hind Passage. But the grades of the lots on the lower numbers are much higher. So we don't anticipate that they would need to take advantage of this provision. And as an example, 29 Golden Hind Passage is raised more than 2 feet above base flood elevation. But since the grade of their lot is higher than it is over by the Cove School, they only had to raise the house by 1 3/4 foot. So all of their decks are 2.5 feet in height, less than 3 feet, and don't count towards coverage and don't need any of these regulations. They're able to accomplish their project without these modifications. And additionally, since the grade of their lot is higher, then they're not seeing the saltwater intrusion. They can create landscaped areas and patios and other options besides decks that work for them. There are some other considerations that we've identified. Raising up a deck can create privacy impacts. Oftentimes fences in side yards are only 6 feet high. We allow up to 8 feet. Maybe the public would like to have 9-foot fences, for instance, or there are abilities to write into our ordinance requirements for privacy screening. A privacy screen would be like a fence installed on the deck rail that screens the occupants from the neighbors. I think it's important to remind everyone who's listening that we do allow raised decks in the rear yard right now. We talked about some of those standards, the setbacks for them. And we allow them without a design review unless they get very tall and without privacy screening. So, and I also wanted to remind the room that, what we're talking about is allowing the decks to be raised up. The applicant has an existing deck that they would lift up higher than 3 feet, and that's why we're here today. And then just next steps for staff is we would take your feedback and any member of public's feedback and further refine some of these amendments and bring that to the planning commission. The planning commission, town council is the decision maker for any changes to our zoning ordinance. That's all that I have. If anybody has any questions, that's great.
Okay, any, go with Phil.
Tracy, thank you very much. The 40 to 44% figure that you were talking about in the beginning, is that the max that you're giving under variances that are being applied for on an ad hoc basis, or?
That's the max allowed under existing regulations. So if one were to apply for a permit to, we'll just take the example that's most relevant, to elevate their house. We have created exemptions to design review for that. And they would provide us with a lot coverage calculation because most likely there'd be at least a minimal change in lot coverage. And with that application, most homes that are not raising their homes, they can have 40% coverage, and you get the extra when you elevate it, you get the extra 2%. And then when we changed lot coverage in 2017, we added another 2%, and that's for covered patios and just very commonplace trellises that we observed were present in the R1 zone. You've probably seen what I'm talking about, the covered rear patio, and that's an extra 2%. And we're looking to resolve the number of lot coverage variances we're processing at the time. Our lot coverage was the most restricted in the county. So the 40% is the default. And then in certain instances, when meeting certain criteria, you can get an additional 4%.
I think that answered it. So you really, even if you're going in for a variance, you're probably not going over 44% currently.
We discourage someone from applying lot coverage. And I think that's part of why we're here today, because while these amendments would apply to a limited number of properties, there's nothing separately unique about them that granting of a variance would be warranted. A variance is for some sort of unique characteristic that your property has that is unlike all the others that are similarly zoned in vicinity in the community. That means that you can break the rules that everybody else has to follow.
Yeah.
That's kind of why if we have too many variances for the same thing, then that's why we would say we need to amend our code.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Kenton, anything?
Not really. I mean, I read this beforehand and I think it's reasonable and logical that people would get this benefit if they're raising their house to be able to have the deck be commensurately raised. I think it's a good proposal.
Nate? Sally?
Just one question. So, and I guess maybe this is the community members, does the recommendations that they provide enough coverage, like what we're offering and as the policy solution would be a solution to the problem for most of the people in that area? I guess that's the one question.
Yes.
Okay.
Sachi?
Just, I think, I've been in this situation. I am in this situation. Our deck is our backyard. And so I think anything that kind of supports allowing, backyards to become usable. And I think though, right now, this seems like it's applying for in the instance that the applicant is trying to raise their home, right? Is there consideration for like retroactively doing improvements, right? That the house, let's say the home was already raised maybe by a prior property owner, right? But now, these, because I think we have some neighbors who basically took out coverage and now, expecting air quotes to be able to, have a deck or some other way to make that a usable space. But right now it's a mud pit for all intents and purposes. And so I think we need to be thoughtful about how this applies, not just to people looking forward with raising their homes, but, people who might have purchased a home that's already raised that might also merit at least consideration for allowing kind of those kind of coverage variations, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
Because it just, as I say, we love our properties on the water, but, they do flood and, so just some food for thought.
David?
I'm just thinking, sea level rise is happening and everything the flood board is doing is to protect property owners from that. So if it takes a higher fence ordinance and decrease setback to the water line, I don't see a major impact on open space. That the setback rules and lot coverage are meant to protect and enforce.
I'd like to echo Sachi's comment that, people that bought a home with a deck not raised should be able to, apply for a permit to raise the deck up to what everybody else is able to do at that same elevation. The other comment I would make is that it looks like this should be extended down Seawolf, Key Largo, and the end of Spindrift for people that are on the water and raising their houses also. I wondered why you sort of cut it off on Golden Hind.
That's the properties along the higher numbers of Golden Hind are what we're aware of have regular intrusion of water and sit at a lower level and are need the modifications to our ordinance in order to accomplish the raised decks. Those on Key Largo and Seawolf, while some of those folks have raised their homes, they're not going very high because the grade of those lots is higher. And so they're able to, I said before, accomplish the additional decks, landings, and stairs that they need within our existing lot coverage limits. And then they have the ability to have yards with something other than decks in it that's meaningful to them. And we'd appreciate the feedback of anybody there and yourselves included. We'll certainly look at including them as well. But that's the reason, that's the thought so far.
Yeah, I mean, just in my view of Mariner Cove, houses on Seawolf and Key Largo, Spindrift, into Spindrift, they're, more or less the same elevation as homes on the lower end of Golden Hind Passage or the middle part of Golden Hind Passage. And a number of them have raised their home and will continue to do so with remodeling, need to level the house. And they should be able to also have their deck brought up if they have an existing deck. So that would be my thought. Anything else?
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
Plus, we don't know in 5 or 10 years what it's going to look like. Might as well forecast for issues in the future.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Are there any members of the public that wish to address this? Do we have anybody online that would like to address this?
No one has their hands up right now.
Okay, well, this was information only, getting feedback. You have what you need?
So.
Okay. All right. Next item. Sea level rise and subsidence data update.
Yep. Yeah. So Vice Chair Bongren has prepared a presentation for us, and I think I'll let you go into it, but I believe you summarized data from our storm drain master plan and available sea level rise data.
Yeah, you can, if you wouldn't mind putting that graph up. So in the many years I've been on the flood control board, we've had plenty of conversations about what current tides are doing, what the sources of flooding are. As Roy, who called in at the beginning, said, the subsidence issue was not mentioned. Oh, good, you have these slides as well. So what I wanted to do was have a common understanding for members of the flood board and the town and the community to understand what the historic land surface and sea level has been, what it is now, and what it's predicted to be in the future. I did that by looking at one specific location. The graph that's at the end of this focuses on the sanitary pump station at Ebb Tide and Golden Hind. And we all know that is a place we've had pop-up events, and it's probably where you get some of the deepest water during high tides. So that's why I chose that location as one of the more floodable zones. This is a little graph I found that basically illustrates on the left that it's not just sea level rise that we need to worry about. It's also the subsidence that Roy mentioned, and I'll go into that a little bit. You can go to the next one. So this is looking from Ebb Tide across Golden Hind to the sanitary pump station. The arrow is meant to be pointing at a surveyed location that's inside the pump station, but that's a location that was recently surveyed. So the graphs I show are basically zeroed to that location. That's why I wanted to show that as that low spot, and we know the precise elevation of it today. Next one. So what I tried to do was use the official sources that the town of Corte Madera uses for both subsidence, surveying elevations, for predicted sea level rise, and for past sea levels. So this should be available on the town website, hopefully, but all of the blue ones are actual links to the documents I used. And as far as I know, these are the official documents. The first subsidence study that was done at the behest of the town was the AN West 2007 report. And in that, they were able to show elevations, including Ebb Tide and Golden Hind, at the time fill was placed for Mariner Cove's construction in 1958. They were able to get up to 2007 with surveyed elevations, and then they made predictions of future subsidence, and they based that on core samples that were taken throughout the neighborhood, and they looked at the compressive strength of the bay muds and the depth of the bay muds, and were able to calculate what they saw as the future compression and future subsidence. I've questioned that document in the past, but I no longer do because it's been corroborated by two sources very recently. The first is a paper in Science magazine called Variable Vertical Land Motion and Its Impacts on Sea Level Rise. And they talk about this at a national level, but they zero in on specifically Corte Madera in one section. And they talk about the current rates of subsidence, and these are measured by satellites throughout Corte Madera. And so these are very accurate to the millimeter measurements, and they show an identical subsidence rate in 2024 that the AN West paper showed. So is exactly the same. We also have the updated Town of Corte Madera Storm Drain Master Plan, and the company Schaff and Wheeler, who prepared that for the town, also revisited the AN West data and looked at new survey data, and they also corroborated an almost identical subsidence rate. So I'm now very confident that what we're seeing today and what we've predicted in the past are very good data and very good predictions. As far as sea level rise goes, the California Ocean Protection Council is the ultimate author of periodic state of California sea level rise guidance. There was guidance many years ago, and we've been waiting and waiting for an update. And I ended up preparing this presentation once we got the 2024 update. And that document shows what current sea level increase rates are in site-specific locations throughout California, including right here in the Bay. So it gives a very localized estimate of what sea level rise will be. And so that I'll go into a little bit more of the multitude of estimates that are shown in that paper a little bit later. The link is there as well. As far as tides go, I don't believe the town has an official stance on where to measure tides, but NOAA has a tide gauge directly across from Mariner Cove in Richmond that's on bedrock, and it's been there for decades. It's very reliable. It's a long-term, highly, every 6 seconds or something like that with data, and you can parse out a lot of stuff from that location. I would suggest that the elevations of sea level at that tide gauge are no different than what you see in Mariner Cove. So I think it's a very good source to use. And the final is the ground elevation that's actually been measured in various reports and town commission surveys over the years. So when you take all these things together and look at the past, and you can go to the next slide, Chris, and then go to the future, this is the most recent storm drain master plan. It's sort of a busy chart, but the area I've highlighted on the left shows the bay mud thickness. The estimated thickness at ebb tide and Golden Hind is 90 feet. So you go along that line and it shows you essentially the estimates of future settlement along with the existing measured settlement that's already occurred since placement of fill. So I use these to create the past subsidence that I show in the graph, and also use this to show the future estimated subsidence. The next one. This is the Science magazine article that corroborated the AN West subsidence measurements. But cut to the chase in the middle, they're looking at a rate of 10 millimeters per year, 0.4 inches per year, which is currently substantially more than sea level rise. So it's really important to take in subsidence, especially along the coast of Mariner Cove, because subsidence is a larger impact today than sea level rise. But it is very, very much the same as other sources we're seeing. And that's what I say in the second bullet, how it closely matches the estimates that we've seen in the past. This is taken directly from the sea level rise guidance for California, which is, as I said, the town's official source for predictions. You can see on the left the year going from 2020 up to 2150. So the graph I'll show later goes up to 2150 as well. The description of these different estimates is different than the last guidance. So I'll do my best to explain what I think they were trying to do here. I used a bound of future sea level rise that incorporated the two boxed titles, the intermediate low and the intermediate. It doesn't say it explicitly, but what the text describes is that the midpoint between the intermediate low and the intermediate seems to be about the 50% probability, the P50 for tide rise, or the median expected tide rise. The low end at intermediate low and the high end at intermediate it encompasses probably most of the probabilistic possibilities that we see out there. It doesn't give a number, but it seems like it's maybe 20% to 80% of the probable sea level rises is within this range. It's possible that it can go much higher, as you can see to the columns at the right. It does specifically say that those scenarios only come into play if there's a nonlinear change in sea level. And what I mean by that is it's not just seawater expansion because of heat. It's not just melting from Antarctica and Greenland. It's a catastrophic ice sheet collapse somewhere. So those things can happen, but without catastrophic collapse, they will not happen. So if things are just melting and warming, we're going to probably see something in the range that's in those red boxes, and that's why I use those. And next one. That's just a picture of the Richmond tide gauge, built on bedrock in a very solid building and maintained by the government, and hopefully will continue to be maintained by the government. One of the things you can see at the small graph at right is that there's two offset lines, and the blue line is the predicted tide, or otherwise known as the astronomical tide. And what that means is that's what the tide would be if there were no other influence but the basically location of the moon and the sun. The red line there shows a higher measured tide, and that can be from a couple reasons. When storms are present, you can picture the old weather maps you see with the big red H for a high pressure and a blue L for the low pressure. And those actually exert pressure and deform the surface of the ocean. So a high pressure area actually depresses the ocean, and a low pressure area allows the ocean to rise underneath it. So when you have low pressure coming in from the west, it is actually a mound of seawater that's traveling with that low pressure and into the bay, essentially. So you can see those differences, and they're much larger when you have a big low pressure system come in. Those differences can be as much as 2 feet higher than the predicted tide. You can also see once those big storms pass, if it's very wet in California and there's a storm that soaks the whole state, the mouth of the bay is actually the mouth of a river system that drains the entire state, basically. And it takes another day or two for all those rivers to empty their water into the bay. And that water essentially backs up in the bay. And so the level of the bay is slightly higher than the level of the ocean. It's like a bathtub spilling over, essentially. Mm-hmm. And that difference maximum, and you can find this in the data after a big storm, is about 1/2 foot. So you put those together, the maximum amount you can get above an astronomical tide is about 2.5 feet. The highest possible astronomical tide is a tad below 7.5 feet. And you add 2.5 to that, and it's an even 10. So it makes it very easy to think, what's the maximum possible storm plus tide we could get? And it's a 10-foot tide. The biggest we've ever seen is just under 8.7. So they've never all coincided like that. It's always been a foot and a third below, but 10 feet is the maximum. And in my graph, I'm using that 10-foot maximum. Next one. And then the ground elevation is measured by a number of surveys. So we've got actual data to compare all those sea levels and subsidence too. And that includes the location right here at ebb tide and Golden Hind. Next one.
That was 7.2.
That was the 7.2 is the elevation of the surveyed location. That tide right there was probably maybe just below 8.
Okay.
Or around 8.
Yeah.
And the maximum
the
tide here, 7.2, and the maximum tide possible is 10. So that location could be 2.8 feet underwater in a big storm. So luckily we've never seen that. So that was, I felt you need to get all that background to understand why this is just such a simple graph. But this Excel also has all the backup tables that I just talked about and the calculations I used, and that can be available too. It's pretty simple going left to right from past to future. The green line is the elevation of the land at ebb tide and Golden Hind, and the blue line is the maximum tide, that 10-foot tide I described up to present, and then bifurcating into those two ranges into the future. So I'll just point out a couple of things here. First is that the leftmost part of those graphs is 1958 when the fill was placed, and ebb tide and Golden Hind, kind of doing a calculation for what used to be there, it was about over 11 feet, 11.7 feet. And the maximum possible tide was just under 10 because sea level hadn't risen that much. So the biggest tide possible, you're high and dry by a few feet all across Mariner Cove. Since then, as you can see, the green line going up to 2024, there's been about 4 feet of subsidence there and very little, less than a foot of sea level rise. So subsidence is really the issue in Mariner Cove at present. In 2024, that black line that's showing the range there, As I said, the maximum possible water depth at that location currently with a big tide and a storm would be 3 feet. And then going into the future, looking at the sea level rise based on guidance and the subsidence based on guidance, we see by 2774, 50 years from now, that location could be between 5.3 and 5.8 feet underwater during a big storm. And then finally out to 2150, 125 years from now, that location could be as much as 12 feet underwater. We're not going to build anything today based on that location being potentially 12 feet underwater, but it gives you an idea of the scale of what we're going to be facing in the future. And the importance of what we've talked about a lot is that anything we do needs to be flexible and buildable, in that we might build a structure at some point and have to expand it in the future. It wouldn't make sense to build something and then have to tear it down and rebuild it, for instance. And Foster City is a good example. They did this, and they have a plan that's very much easy to add to their seawall that they've built there. So I'll leave it at that if there's any questions, but all the data and data sources are available for you to check, and second guess me, please do. But I just hope this is helpful for us to think about what we're facing in the future.
David, any question?
No, impressive work. Thank you.
Sachi?
But thank you. It's really helpful to frame the scale or the magnitude.
Sally?
I submitted it to the town, so I don't know if you're going to post it or.
Yeah, I mean, we can post it on site where we have our Corte Madera DAP's website, so potentially we could put it there. But yeah, it's whatever sports.
Yeah, I mean, if you're willing, I tried to make sure that this was in line with what the town's doing. This isn't my going off on a tangent on what I think. So I hope it's completely in line with the way the town's looking at these issues, and that it could be useful for town as well, not just for being alarmist or anything. Yeah. Yeah, those reports are all on the website. So
Yeah, they're available. And I mean, it's easy to all the data here. It will sit straight out of our report. So
yeah.
Okay.
Well, I think this is great. I think we're just people going to better when to with questions and the data.
Yeah.
Kenton?
No, it's very helpful information to look at and know and understand the subsidence issue better, for sure.
Yeah.
First, thank you. This obviously took a lot of work, and everybody is more knowledgeable because of your work on that. So thank you for doing that. I'm reminded that we made great progress on that berm project that's going out for design, and that project, which many people in that neighborhood are thrilled to hear, but the life cycle on that is like 5+ years into the future. We're not even talking about Mariner Cove and how to get that property in that neighborhood controlled. And so when we look into the future, what kind of problems we're dealing with, it certainly makes it very present how quickly we need to act to do something.
I do have a quick question. Are we supposed to be having this one or is it? So this is for Mariner Cove. I don't know if it includes the village over there. Sorry. But what about like Madera Gardens? Is that also having subsidence issues or not as much because there's not the tide, or is it compacted greater? I mean, has anybody considered if that area is subsiding as well?
I think the Schaffen Wheeler focuses on Mariner Cove and like Echo and those areas. But the NSAR radar work that was done over a larger swath of Corte Madera, and I didn't see anything specific in a report, but that data does exist somewhere. It could be, we could find out who produced the science report and see if we could request it and see. But it really is, as I showed in that one chart that I used the 90-foot bay mud number. And if you go down that chart, the deeper the mud, the more the subsidence. So I think it is much shallower bedrock there. And it's really a function of how deep the bay mud is that causes the subsidence, which is the real problem now. And this subsidence is only specific to 90-foot bay mud, which is only at the edge of Mariner Cove.
That's my understanding as well. I think Madera Gardens was also built over a marsh, but was not as deep. And also that part of town is mostly protected by levees. So we weren't focusing as much in that report on the settlement.
Yeah, really great, great report and great study on that. There is a map out showing, well, primarily Mariner Cove, about the depth of the bay mud. And as Nate says, it's 90 to 100 or 100 or 110 feet on the edge of Golden Hind. And then as you go further towards Paradise, it gets much shallower, till it, actually gets to bedrock at a couple of places. But this is also the reason that we're looking at putting seawall, behind this low portion. One of the things that I've always wondered, I guess I always assumed that when they brought the fill in and put that in, that it was more or less at the same level. But yet what we've seen is certain areas have settled to a greater extent than others. I always thought the ebb tide pump station, just the amount of concrete, equipment, everything caused that to settle more. But I also notice I'm at 89, and as you go down to 55, that had dropped a good deal more. All of those homes have been elevated over the years, and you can walk the street and see the driveways just slope further down as you go around that bend on Golden Hind. So I've always wondered, what it was that caused the differential settlement in some places. And Roy Wolford has always pointed out that that one spot on off Spindrift where it really drops almost 6 feet, comes back up a little bit. That was a huge area of settlement. I can't remember which street that's on.
We have a lot of the drainage issues because all the roll drains were built to drain in a certain direction, and it settled differentially, and all of a sudden you get these low spots.
Yeah, well, this is a dramatic low spot there. Yeah.
I mean, I tried not to editorialize and just keep this factual, but the one editorializing I've done is I grew up on Golden Hind. My parents still live there. And when I've talked to neighbors, a concern is that any sort of barrier would impede their use of their property or their view. And while I concede that it might impede the value of property now, somewhere there's an inflection point where not having a barrier is going to be the inflection point where it's going to impede the value of the property. There's a lot of talk about climate change affecting the way we all live, and a lot of it comes down to insurance. And if you have an uninsurable world, then you have sort of an unlivable world. And I think a big part of what we can do as a flood control board is make sure Corte Madera stays insurable, basically.
Yeah, and I think to your point, talking about Foster City, is doing a seawall. You want to do it for the next 50 years. So that will probably not impact people's view, especially people that have raised their houses along that stretch of about 14, 15 houses. But you also want to be able to add to it in the future without having to tear that out and start anew. Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Chris, 2025 flood control projects.
Okay. So I'll just be going over basically the first round of projects that we are pulling from recommendations out of our storm drain master plan. So starting this year, we're trying to get 4 projects going and potentially one more if we have time. But those ones are the short-term pump station repair project, the gravity storm drain replacement project, just general storm drain maintenance, which just includes cleaning and CCTV, and then Shorebird Marsh pump station replacement. So I'll go a little bit more in depth on all of these. And then the last one is the open channel maintenance, which is basically pulling material out of our open channels around town to improve drainage. But that one's a little more challenging. It's going to require environmental regulatory permits. So we don't know if we'll have time to start that this year.
So this high canal and low canal you're talking about?
It wouldn't be high canal. I think it would be low canal. And then the channels behind like Nugget Market. There's a few others kind of peppered around town that are kind of overdue for dredging out.
Uh-huh. Okay.
So first one was the short-term pump station repair. Basically, this project is a recommendation from Schaff and Wheeler to try and get all the urgent items for all of our flood control pump stations. And you can see here is a list of, some of that work. A lot of it's just replacing cathodic protection, recoding components, replacing pump controllers that are like 30 plus years old and aren't working well anymore and are really difficult to get parts for. Adding backup level sensors that basically is insurance for us because we've had actually recent issues where we only have one sensor, it breaks, and then the pumps don't turn on. And so that can cause flooding events if our staff aren't aware of it. And then basically just any other structural or anything else that the engineers recommend replacing in the short term. So we have started design on that project, and we're basically going to design everything and then try and, depending on how it works out, we're planning to break it into 2 pieces, and we'll try and get the first half done this year, and then potentially the second half next year if we were able to get it done in time. And that recommendation, the total cost of all the work was 1.9 million. So potentially, we're talking about breaking that into 2 $950,000 projects. And we're still looking at it. Some of it we've actually already done since the report is out, so that's good. But we still have to kind of figure out the final price tag for that project.
Yes, excuse me.
Yeah, no problem. So Chris, just maybe this is the separate but related. So like on the controllers for the pump stations on the high water, if like an alarm goes off, how does that, kind of alarm go and who does it go to?
We have a system, I think, at all of our pump stations. If there's pump failures or like issues with the pump station itself, it sends, I can't remember if it's either a text or an email to whoever's on duty.
Okay.
Our maintenance staff. So they find out pretty quick.
So there's somebody at least kind of on call 24/7 during the wet season, for example.
Yeah. Well, there's someone on.
There are at least one, if not 2 staff members that get texted with the alarm.
Thank you.
Continue.
Okay. So that's the first project. Second one, gravity storm drain replacement project. This is basically combining capacity related projects that were recommended as well as condition related storm drain projects, mostly on just gravity storm drains. So we kind of went for the worst of the worst to start and like identified which ones around town made sense to group together. So those were located on Hart Street, Palm Ave, Sonora Way, Corte Madera Ave, Chapman, Stetson, Montecito, and Pfeiffer. So we have $1 million to spend, and we're kind of picked more than we can afford to do, and we're gonna just kind of figure out which ones are going to be easier or harder, and then basically shape the projects based off the budget. So those ones are all capacity related. Most of them are corrugated metal pipe that's corroded, and generally the bottom half of the pipe's just gone at this point. And so those are kind of a ticking time bomb, because if you let it go too long, it can cause a sinkhole. Eventually the whole road can drop if it's under a road or whatever it goes under. And then the second part is the capacity storm drain projects. So we picked 3 of those to look into. on Pixley, Key Largo course, and Hart Street. So I think I've got some pictures. Oh yeah, and then there was one other one we're taking a look at on Tamla Vista Boulevard. I'm sure everyone's driven by that once. There's an area that kind of floods right near one of the hotels. Yeah, and so we're going to see what's going to be required to basically reroute the storm system to drain that during storms. And this one is currently in design by another one of our on-call engineering firms, Bennett.
Chris, the one on Key Largo, is that going to be a liner? Do you have an easement to dig that up and replace it?
That's something we need to figure out. It's the pipe that goes in between the houses through an easement out to the bay. So, and they're recommending, or Chaffin Wheeler recommended, to increase the capacity. So we can't line that one. We'd have to just replace it. So that one has a big maybe because it outfalls into an area kind of by the fire station.
Yeah.
So we'll have to see if it's going to be possible or if it's going to be a more difficult project. So here is a picture of the Tamla Vista issue. Right now, I think we may have talked about this once before, but right now it drains towards the freeway and it outfalls into a ditch that's maintained by Caltrans, or they haven't been maintaining it. So because of environmental issues. So the water basically just backs up every time it rains here. So the goal would be hopefully to basically create a new outlet for it towards the lagoon or High Canal. So that's what we're going to look at. And if it's possible and it doesn't cost too much, we'll try and do it this year. Otherwise, we'll look at it in future years. And then here's a few examples of pipes that we're going to replace. The top left, or the three on the right, and then on the top left are all corrugated metal pipes that are just completely corroded. You can see the large gap underneath that's starting to form, which will eventually turn into a sinkhole. The bottom left is just an example of like an offset joint, just like other issues we have with pipes. And then these are pulled out of the master plan. So the top left is the Pixley equalizer. Basically, we have two very large culverts that run parallel, but they're not connected. So when Chaffin Wheeler modeled the system, it showed flooding issues during a 10-year or larger storm, which could be solved by basically just creating connections. So this one was kind of a low-hanging fruit that could improve the system. So we're going to try and include that. The bottom right, we already talked about, that's Key Largo. So it's just replacing two pipes and increasing the size. But the location makes it fairly difficult. The top right is the one on Tamla Vista, basically just kind of a map view showing what our goal is. So the storm drain maintenance, we've basically had a budget for this every year, but this year we've been more reactive, and this year we're trying to be more proactive. We're going to start picking storm drains to clean out. So hopefully starting in May. I think we had budgeted $200,000 to spend. So we have a list from the master plan and a list that our maintenance staff have come up with just based off, looking around town. And there's some pipes that are, 50 to 100% full of sediment and basically aren't functioning anymore. And you don't see the issues unless there's a large storm. So the goal is to kind of deal with it ahead of time. The one issue we've been having is getting rid of the materials that you pull out is extremely difficult these days. They won't let us just take it to the dump. And even, people who have properties that allow soil, you have to first drain the water out of it, test it for all sorts of chemicals and different things before you can take it. So, and unfortunately in Corte Madera, we have very little space to store, a bunch of soil that we're pulling out of these pipes. So we have a plan. We're going to use our staging area on Paradise, and basically like we're going to get bins in a big tank to store the soil, let it drain, dry out, and then we have to test it and then get rid of it. But all that adds a bunch of costs and reduces the number of pipes we can clean each year. So it's unfortunate, but that's just kind of where we are right now.
Where's that staging area?
It's kind of a big shoulder pullout on Paradise as you just before you get to like the Ring Mountain Trail.
Behind the Herc rental place, kind of?
No, it's farther to the east. Westward is the closest cross street.
Past Golden Pine.
Yeah.
Just don't dispose of it in Bayside Trail Park again.
Oh yeah, no. We wouldn't be disposing it. It's just and when we were using that area, it was just same thing, it was temporary storage. So
Thank you.
we're shifting now to that staging area.
Yeah, but I want to emphasize what Chris said. This is going to be a big problem or issue moving forward. It's going to become very costly to maintain our existing storm system, given the constraints we have to basically do this procedure. So the more support and we can gain from you all and others in the community, it's of course going to be an eyesore driving down the street and seeing these, bins and boxes full of soil and wondering, what the heck are the public works people doing? But that's the only path forward we have at the moment. And the next one would be probably purchasing property in some other jurisdiction and using that as a waste management site. So yeah, please keep an open mind.
Who's the regulatory body that oversees and requires that?
I mean, each of the landfills has their own requirements, but also they're following regulations on like what they can accept.
Okay, so it's not like the DTSC or anybody like that.
I'm not sure.
Just the receiving facility itself.
Yeah, that's my understanding, and it just keeps getting stricter and stricter. I
You have to
think
get a
mostly
permit
because
from
of
DTS.
regulations.
Sachi.
Landfill regulation is by the Regional Water Quality Control Board. So, but they're regulated, I believe it's chapter 15 now for landfills. So in order for it to be properly cover, it's got to be non-hazardous, right? Which is why all the testing you've got to do. And so it's hard to get rid of anything solid anymore.
Sally? Oh,
One other thought is one thing, I think, Bob, you maybe mentioned it, I don't know if it was at a meeting or whatever, but that particularly like in Mariner Cove, it seems like people use mulch, bark. And a lot of that, it'll be interesting to see that when you start pulling stuff out of storm drains, some of it is landscape material, right? Because maybe that's the other flip side of it is, can we start educating these like no bark and no mulch, it's like, use rocks or whatever with your weed cloth. Because if then it's triggering us to pay even more to get rid of it because it ends up in the storm drain, then, I think we need to start kind of actively understanding what the source of it is, depending on where it is, right? Because I think people uniformly, their gardener comes, they bring mulch in and, it'll be effort, but it may pay off for us in the long term, right?
Well, I would actually take it a step further, Sachi. It's mandated by Marin Municipal Water as part of projects that are regulated by their landscape renovation process. So they require 3 inches of mulch. And then same thing with SB, drawing a blank on the number. We have to use, I think our number is 700 plus cubic yards of mulch or compost in Corte Madera a year. So it's these, different entities pushing different things that maybe don't always align.
Yeah, I think Sachi's talking about the median strips that are low, streets flood, it all washes out into the street and down the storm drains. I've put that in the newsletter a couple times. I should do that regularly. Maybe we could put it if we're allowed to, put that in the flood newsletter that goes out each year.
Yeah, I don't, like you mentioned earlier, I don't think we're allowed to modify that anymore.
Yeah.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is we are actively looking at placing more mulch based on state mandates. And we're looking at putting them on our medians because we have to hit this target number of something like 700 cubic yards a year of mulch or compost. And as a public entity, there's only so many spots we can do that on private parcels. And so we are limited, and most jurisdictions are limited to medians and other things. So we're between a rock and a hard place is all I'm saying. And it's hard to get each of these jurisdictions and regulatory agencies to really align on one common goal.
I was thinking about the median strips in people's front of people's homes that are low, and that's where all of this comes from in the street. Certainly, mulch on higher elevations is good. Sally.
Sorry, I just want to go back to the Tamla Vista flood for just a second. I'm sure that's not the arrows that were pointing, like where the reroute could go into the lagoon. Just a note of caution that that's where it's really shallow in the lagoon, is right across the street from that. So if it gets rerouted and the water goes into that area, I just want to be mindful, like when you're doing that design, to think about that.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we'll look at elevations and make sure it doesn't actually go the other direction, start draining out of the lagoon. I think in all likelihood, it would probably go towards High Canal because that is much lower and we'll have more fall to play with.
Yeah. Okay.
I think what Sally's saying is we already have problems in that lagoon and we don't want to compound that problem
Sure.
with the toxic toxic sediment that's already coming in. Thank you.
Yep. Understood. All right. And then the last project I'll be talking about is the Shorebird Marsh Pump Station replacement. So this is going to be a multi-year project to replace Shorebird Marsh, which is, I believe, our oldest pump station and in dire need of improvement. So the total estimated cost was $8 million. And of course, this is in a marsh, and it goes, the outfall pipes go through the levee. So there's going to be a lot of environmental aspects that go along with this. So we're currently requesting proposals from some of our on-call engineering firms, and hopefully we'll get this started soon because it'll take several years. And the pump station has a lot of issues with corrosion and other things. And the pumps currently it's not connected to the power grid, so they're all diesel pumps, which definitely could be improved on.
The question I would have, if we're going to upgrade that, Larkspur has some of their storm water, flowing into that area, and they have the smaller pump station even at a very low level right next to it. If we're going to take this on, could we get some money from Larkspur to help with this project and eliminate their pump station?
I mean, we can definitely look into that. I wasn't aware a lot of their storm drainage was going into here. I believe a lot of the area on the east side of the freeway, on Redwood Highway, that all drains into Blackhead Lagoon. So that's one that's like a large portion of the drainage going in there is either Larkspur or the county, or Caltrans.
Well, I always thought the small pump station just north of Shorebird, right next to it, was Larkspur, and that was supposed to pump out from some of the water that was on end of Industrial Way and the mobile home parks and such.
I believe you're correct, Bob. There is a second pump station, and I believe it's Larkspur. And I think you're right, it's Larkspur.
Yeah, I guess the only question is, does it pump into Shorebird Marsh, or does it go over the levee and then it wouldn't be attributing to? shorebird marsh. So in that case, then they probably wouldn't contribute. But we'll definitely look into it.
Yeah, I thought I mean, it's right next to it. I thought it went to the outflow channel that Shorebird Marsh, drains out of.
Yeah, well, I'll definitely add that.
That's my understanding, Bob.
Yeah, it seems like it would be reasonable to have a efficiency of scale there and just do one project. I mean, theirs is completely falling apart and leaking. If it's what I saw, I mean, it's just like water's leaking out of the pipe. Somebody wrapped some black tape around it or something. Yeah, why not just do one good one at one time?
I think it's a good suggestion. We'll definitely reach out to them.
Okay. And then, yeah, this was pulled from the Storm Drain Master Plan, basically just showing Shorebird Marsh. And so our pump station is just draining this whole area, which acts as a detention basin for the pump station. So actually the pump station isn't that large, but it has all this volume during large storms to store the stormwater. And that was the last part of that first item 5A. So questions?
Continue.
Okay. And let's see. It's like nobody online. So on to item 5B, regional sea level rise coordination. So this was a future agenda item from last time. And so the town, basically the two organizations that we have been coordinating with are Baywave and Baycan. Baywave is run by Marin County and it's kind of more localized. Baycan is more, it stands for Bay Area Climate Adaptation Network. So it's like larger throughout the Bay Area. And so both these organizations kind of work to share information and share, individual projects for adaptation and sea level rise risk. So, and then I think Vice Chair Blomgren already mentioned this, but Storm Drain Master Plan in the town uses the 2024 sea level rise guidance by the Ocean Protection Council. Our different planning documents, projects. And Baywave has separate sea level rise guidance.
So yeah, I'm happy to touch on this. So there's a right. So one of the earlier studies was this vulnerability study from 2017, prepared by the county. Several agencies have since also taken on their own adaptation efforts, although ours is probably the farthest along out of the other jurisdictions. Currently, many are trying to get to where we are, where we have an accepted document, an adaptation planning document. Many do not. There is a group of elected officials, climate adaptation coordinators, folks like myself and others that attend a monthly meeting called the Baywave Steering Committee to really kind of look at what's going on around the region, around the Bay, advising on kind of the latest kind of revisions to any of these kind of regulation documents or new projects that are happening, share information about funding sources. So it's a very, engaged group that's really focused on this. Separately, Transportation Authority Marin is in the late stages of completing their sea level rise adaptation planning document, and I wanted to share what it shows for Corte Madera and Larkspur on that. If I can share a screen here. So this is available on the Transportation Authority of Marin webpage. So just type in Transportation Authority Marin adaptation, And this is a really good time to look at this document because it's still in its draft phase. We're actually meeting as a technical advisory group tomorrow as our final session. And then that'll lead into this potentially getting approved by the Transportation Authority Marin Board. So, you know, this is the perfect time to read this document, make comments, make suggestions, ask questions, all those good things. There is a section here that is dedicated to Corte Madera and Larkspur. And so you can see a lot of what they've incorporated are things from our climate adaptation assessment. However, they've also gone and kind of looked at Corte Madera Creek and upstream of that. And one other thing that's happening is between the town, Corte Madera, Larkspur, and County Marin, we've applied for a sea level rise planning grant. I believe it's through using RM3 funds to study the smart corridor from basically San Clemente Park all the way up to the Green Bay Boardwalk. So that's pending at the moment, but those are really kind of the main efforts that are happening in the county that we're all coordinating on, and happy to answer any questions on it.
RJ, I recall that there was probably a 1995 study that looked to try to extend that north-south right-of-way levee to the overpass and up Corte Madera Creek. It got shut down because a couple of property owners on the west side of 101 objected to the seawall that was planned to be put in there. But is that a variation of what TAM is looking at?
You know, it's been brought up, right? So there's, you know, right, there's people who say, hey, why don't you just berm off right at the Golden Gate Bridge? Or other people who say, why don't you just berm off between San Quentin and Corte Madera? And the current reality is that the regulatory agencies would not allow that. So until such time that the environmental regulations and laws change, it's otherwise just an idea that really it's hard to really put money into when you know it clearly does not follow the regulations. So I don't know if that's answer your question, but it certainly comes up every now and then.
And something I would ask RJ is, I think what Bob was suggesting is Corte Madera Creek is in the concrete structure past College of Marin, but as it opens up, there's currently bike paths on both sides that are levees, but if those were extended and raised, they could be connected to Corte Madera potential levees as well. And so I had wondered in the past, like, that's certainly feasible, or is it feasible to actually block off Corte Madera Creek and pump it out during storms? And so I just looked at the flows in Corte Madera Creek in the past and what the max flows are. And it's like New Orleans level of pump station that would be required. So it seems like the only plausible way would be to find some way to protect Corte Madera and join it somehow upstream up Corte Madera Creek and join in with the College of Marin Cement Channel. So I'd be very curious if you talk to other people, especially the ones that run those areas, and see what their thoughts are.
Yeah, I mean, as you go further up Corte Madera Creek, the jurisdictions get less concerned about their own cellularized vulnerabilities, right? If you're in Fairfax, it's really not top of mind. You know, we for Corte Madera specifically, you know, our point, one of our weakness points is right by the courtyard on Lucky Drive, where we do observe and experience the road inundating with floodwaters. So we do have a couple scenarios there, and we're pursuing that to kind of shore that element up in the, call it, near term. I just think in terms of like a massive tide gate, that's really a longer term approach that would probably require a lot of other things to happen before the regulations would change to allow that, or the funding would be there. I mean, we looked at it as part of the climate adaptation assessment. Just hypothetically, what would it cost to put a tide gate, at the end of San Clemente Creek? And, at the time, and I'm sure cost escalation has gone up, it was $20 million. And so, I can only imagine at least a zero at the end of that, and probably more to put something like of the magnitude that it would require at Corte Madera Creek. So again, I think it just, it's probably going to be a gradual approach, and eventually things might get so drastic that the regulations allow something like that, but currently they don't.
Any other comments, questions? Okay. Traffic control during flooding, Mariner Cove.
Okay. Yeah, so this was another future agenda item by a board member. And so I just wanted to basically share kind of what our plan is right now, and then open it up for discussion on what the board thinks. Basically, like we've discussed this a few times, but during king tide events, or when we believe the Golden Hind Passage will flood, our plan is to basically put road closed to through traffic signs, so that delivery trucks, other people trying to go through the area will have to detour around, but neighbors within that area who hopefully know not to drive fast will be able to enter. So that's kind of the current plan. I mean, in a situation where it's a king tide and a sunny day, it's much more practical for our crews to get out promptly and put up the signs. If during a major storm, they're much more busy. So, if Golden Hind starts flooding and they're off doing other, like responding to emergencies, it may take time for them to, get the traffic control set up. That's the only issue that we may run into. But that's basically the current plan. So there's comments on that or
Sachi.
questions.
I think mainly it's that, right? Weekends, evenings, stormy days when, crews are already out doing something else. And so the thought that I had was, we live right next to the pump station, right? And if there were signs available and that's where they're staged, I have no issue with going out and setting them up and just, doing the road closure, as long as we're in agreement about what the closure is, right? And, the duration of it, when they go up, when they come down. And I think, Bob, to your point, you might suggest adding a couple more locations possibly too, right?
Well, the other area that floods is Seawolf and Golden Hind, and that gets blocked off often when that happens, and it's fairly easy for people to get around, but trying to keep them from creating more of a tide going through it at a high speed or even a modest speed can impact garages. So the idea is, could volunteers in the community be entrusted with these signs to put them up if DPW is not available?
I think that could be arranged. We just have to find a place to store them that could be accessed by the public, probably near the sanitary pump station. We usually store those inside the pump station, but you need a key to get in.
Yeah, I think if, we come up with a specific plan, like you mentioned, and then we would even, just for everyone's sake, we would train you on how to put the sign up properly in that location. At that point, I think we could probably be fine with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of us who would be willing to be deputized to do that, right?
Yeah.
So,
And I think that, could be stored, in the immediate area of that, in other words, I'm sure that there would be a neighbor that would volunteer to have that beside the house in an area that another neighbor could get to that was deputized.
Yeah, I mean, we're open to suggestions, and we can always plan a time to meet, figure out a place to put the signs, show people what should be done, where the signs go and everything, when they should go out, and then they'll be available. So I think we are open to that. I will say we are going to install another check valve near Golden Hind. It's Golden Hind in Prince Royal, but I think that should help the tidal waters from coming out of the storm drains in that area. Although if there's a storm, then it'll still.
Yeah. Yeah, really, the bigger problem seems to be Seawolf and Golden Hind Passage.
Yeah. I mean,
I think the check valve is just not working sometimes.
yeah. I mean, they always have issues if
Yep.
materials get stuck in them or.
Yeah.
and I think some flexibility on locating the signs, honestly, because back in December, it was flooding into our driveway, which is about where the cove, that entry is. So you have the road closest, there's 3 signs up there. We'd need one even closer, yeah, to that end, because it was, up closer into the school. So, just enough signs that we're kind of geared to any number of occasions, right? So,
So Sachi and I will talk to neighbors to see who might be willing to be deputized and get back to you.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. No, you just really need to close the road. And because there are ways to get around all of these spots. Now, some people may have to walk to their homes, but you can get around and get close. Yeah, yeah. 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 Okay, project updates.
Right. So just 3 quick ones. The 2024 Madera Gardens Storm and Sewer Project is nearing completion. Should be done this week, actually. So they're just basically finalizing some of the contract work, and then it's just punch list stuff. So hopefully by Friday or potentially maybe into a little bit of next week, that should be done. Marina Village flood berm grant. Just wanted to I did an update that we're still waiting. I recently heard that FEMA has basically ended the BRIC grant program. So this one luckily was through the FMA, but there's a very high possibility that they may like cancel all grants. And unfortunately, they've selected us, but it's not like official yet. They keep sending RFIs and we answer their questions. We're just waiting to hear back. So at this point, it's very uncertain, but hopefully get selected officially and get the grant. Yeah. So not the best news, but we're just waiting and seeing right now. And then spring gate maintenance was last week. So our crews were frantically running around, cleaning out all the pump station wet wells and maintaining all the gates, and while water was low. So that, I think they were able to accomplish everything they needed to do. So the water is back to normal in all our lagoons. Usually, potentially next time, we'll have a report from them, what they were able to find, any new issues we need to address. So that's it for project updates.
Okay, so if I skip number 7, does that mean RJ can't retire?
I think so. Yeah, unfortunately, we have to break the bad news that RJ is retiring from the town. So I'll let him.
So yeah, I mean, to, in CalPERS, it's separating because I'm not retirement age, but I am leaving local government. Been doing it since 2000. Well, did a couple years of consulting, engineering consulting, serving a lot of jurisdictions since 2006, and then spent 10 years at the county and since 2018 in Corte Madera. So 1 year shy of 20 years doing it, but decided to move on and give something else a try. So, but it's bittersweet. I really think this is an amazing community. I have nothing but positive and just overall a lot of support from everyone, and I think this is a really great place to work. And I'm gonna miss the camaraderie. I'm gonna miss the staff. I'm gonna miss the community. And yeah, but I'm just gonna move on to a new chapter. So.
Well, speaking, for the flood board, the experience that you had with the county, you were able to come to Corte Madera and really know, what needed to be done and how to get things done. Your ability to help bring in some grants has been greatly appreciated. And, we've moved forward with a lot of projects, and you've put a lot of things in order. And I wish you would stay another few years to see them through, but, sometimes, the timing is such that this is it. So we're going to miss you.
Thank you, Bob. And you guys will be in good hands. One thing that I'm proud of and our team and everyone who's been a part of it is, we put in a lot of work into these various master plans, and they really are going to set us up well for the next, most of them are just completed for the next 10 years. So it's going to act as a really good playbook for staff to continue to carry the torch and do the, high priority work based on the funding we have. And, Chris is going to get an opportunity to be interim director. So I have nothing but confidence in him. I've been working with him for over 10 years. And so, yeah, I think you guys are in good hands.
Yeah, thanks, RJ. Best of luck. And remember, this is going to be harder on your wife than anybody. So.
All right. End of an era.
Yep.
Future agenda items. I think bringing up the issue of the FEMA mandated newsletter that goes out and what can and can't be added to it, just probably informational. It really was unfortunate because we used to put a lot more really good information in there, and FEMA's requirement to just do what they say, is a problem. Sachi.
I don't know if this is out of the spirit of what FEMA says, but can the downtown do its own little insert or addendum to that, which is separate with the other supplemental information?
I'd have to look into, I mean, I know they've made it very clear we can't edit their template.
Sure.
Blood letter. I don't know if we could add something into the same.
Or just like, it's like another page that is entirely separate from, I think, David, you had it there, right? And, can it be just a,
Who's going to print it and paste?
well, if the bulk of it's already kind of getting paid for, because it's whatever, it's a 11 by 17 that's folded, right? And so throw another piece on it.
Yep.
Just a thought.
Yeah.
Not to circumvent FEMA, but I think there's important information that's, that's specific to us, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of my, workaround if we think that we can kind of get away with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we can definitely look into it.
Yeah.
And I'll also try to look and see if the San Francisco Estuary Institute has actually put out some formal recommendations about protecting the Corte Madera marsh, going north. I don't know exactly what they have. And, what I learned in part was talking with Barbara Salzman. So,
Well, and finding out maybe like, what does it cost us to put out a mailer like this, right? And maybe there's other more climate adaptation related content that we can put out once a year that's separate from the FEMA thing, right? And
Yeah.
so if it's, so it's just a cost, right? So if we can budget for
mailing cost.
mailing cost to develop the content. And
Yeah.
obviously that's work too, but but if we maybe just do a one that is like, okay, you got this thing from FEMA, and now this is something that's more specific to what we're doing here.
Corte Madera Flood Board.
What about the Town Chronicle?
They probably need more content.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah,
And or, through the weekly.
Yeah.
Right, a link to a PDF, for flood related stuff. I mean, the work is in developing the content, and obviously there's a cost with, developing anything. So.
okay. Oh, Chat GBT, will, flip it out. Any other thoughts, recommendations, future agenda items? Okay. Meeting adjourned.